Welcome to Reason with Science, where we explore the profound questions that shape how we think and understand the world. In this episode, we are diving into the fascinating intersection of human evolution and culture with one of the most compelling voices in anthropology, Agustín Fuentes. Augustine is a professor, evolutionary theorist, and author of The Creative Spark, where he explores what truly makes us human, not just biologically, but culturally, socially, and creatively. In this episode, we discuss common misconceptions about evolution and explore the complex, branching story of our species. We examine how traits like cooperation, creativity, and social bonding shaped our survival, and why race, gender, sex, and even marriage is far more culturally constructed than biologically fixed. We also dig into big questions around religion, science, and the future of human evolution. Augustine helps us see that to understand where we are going, we first need to understand how we have evolved, not just in body, but in mind, meaning, and imagination. Stay with us. This is a conversation that just might change how you see humanity itself. With that, let's get started. Hi, Augustine. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jitendra, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we want to talk about human evolution, which is not different, thinking about evolution in general, right? So, let's start with something called extended evolutionary synthesis, because this is where uh, our understanding of evolutionary method is, or the evolutionary principle has changed quite a bit since Darwin, right? So let's start with that, and then we can go to to the other topics.
Absolutely. So I think what's really important is so difficult to talk about the extended evolutionary synthesis because what we're really talking about is contemporary evolutionary theory and evolutionary biology, sort of what's going on, what are the different theoretical and methodological threads. What most people mean when they say extended evolutionary synthesis is sort of where we are now in understanding the different dynamic processes of evolution, right? In the many years since Darwin and Wallace first proposed evolution via descent with modification via natural selection, but we now know that natural selection is one of the multiple processes, right? Natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, and mutation are the sort of key traditional processes emerging over the last century that we understand about evolutionary dynamics. But we also now know things like niche construction, right? The relation, the mutual mutability between organisms and their environments is important. We also know that developmental processes, particularly developmental plasticity, can really shape dynamics of evolutionary trajectories. And all of these different forces and others interconnect with one another. So the extended evolutionary synthesis is basically saying, hey, we have a broader toolkit, a broader theoretical frame. Let's bring that to bear on understanding sort of how things evolve. And that also, if I can take a couple more seconds here, has combined with radical changes in technology, right? So we now have not just sort of basic proteomics and genomics, right, that is looking at DNA sequences and protein dynamics, but we also know about epigenomics. We also have a much better understanding of developmental processes. Our technology allows us access to greater detail, and our modeling capacity for understanding biological systems has radically changed. And here, I'm a big critic of a lot of AI stuff, but I think this facilitation via augmentation by AI has allowed us to do sort of analytics that weren't possible even 5 years ago.
And this has also allowed us to sort of understand that, what are our sort of cousin apes, right? Which are extinct now, of course, but let's talk about like the other homos that we know, right?
So one of the most amazing things about the study of human evolution, right, is that it's really the study of hominin evolution and the study of hominoid evolution. That is, so the hominins, right, are the sort of cluster of organisms that sort of, let's say, branched off in the last 7 to 10 million years from a whole bunch of other ape-like things or ape group in the hominoids, and then diversified initially across much of the African continent and then globally over time. And what we know is that we, Homo sapiens sapiens, right? Us, the genus Homo, species sapiens, subspecies sapiens. We're the last standing hominin, right, at this moment. But even, 50, 100, 200,000 years ago, there were clearly other taxa, other groups of hominins. Were they different species? Were they different subspecies? We're not 100% clear. And as you go back over the last 3, 4, 5 million years, we see multiple hominin lineages. So while humans are the last hominin remaining, we know that there was this diversity of taxa, of important lineages in the hominin evolutionary story. And we, right, are the last ones around, which makes things doubly challenging, right? Why are we the only ones standing when there used to be a bunch? And what is distinctive about us? What differentiates us from those others?
Yeah, and I think this also sort of begs the question and understanding of the this messy bush model
Yeah,
of evolution, right? That it's not
yeah,
really sort of a linear trajectory which leads to humans.
yeah.
There were like many other humans around, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that gets into the whole thing. Find someone with a good definition for human, and you're coming close to a Nobel Prize. So there were multiple things that are human-like or humans. We still have that difficulty. But I think your point here that it's not a linear trajectory. We usually see that evolution thing with like a
Yeah, yeah.
chimpanzee thing, then a sort of less chimpanzee thing, then a sort of human thing, then a fully human thing walking along. And that's completely wrong, right? That misrepresents evolutionary dynamics. That's not the way evolution works. This idea of a braided stream or a bushy shrub is much more real, with multiple lineages emerging from each other, coming back and coalescing, coming apart again. That's what the genetic history and the fossil history looks like. And so rather than thinking of a line to humans, we've got like a messy bush of family, and we're the last, members of that family around, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I had another conversation with Chris Stringer,
Mhm.
and he talks about, I mean, and there is like plenty of evidence now, right? That there was a lot of mixing in hominins even,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
not like that these humans, they stayed sort of isolated in that sense.
Yeah. We used to think like humans, Neanderthals,
Yeah.
the Homo, right? Like all these different taxa, these different members of the genus Homo were these different species and totally different. Maybe they fought and killed each other. I mean, maybe they did, but we know that they were also having sex with one another and reproducing offspring. So, for anyone who's interested in sort of biological species concepts, right? This sort of theory, what is a species? How do we measure that? The various hominins, the various members of the genus Homo, don't really fit that in the sense that our DNA has bits and parts of multiple ancestors. And I think that's really interesting. So, what you mentioned, Chris Stringer, I'm sure talked about it. There's a number of scholars who've been studying both the fossil, the archaeological, and of course the genetic records as best we can with ancient DNA, which clearly demonstrates that the story of human history is sort of like this messy stuff with lots of populations. Most populations over the last few million years probably went extinct, but many more than just one gave rise to humans.
And that makes also our evolutionary history more dynamic, right? That means
Yeah,
it's not really, again, a sort of static stuff where things are happening
yeah.
only at periods of time. It's continuously stuff is happening, and then which leads to humans, basically us.
Yeah, which is not surprising at all if you study evolution of anything, right?
Yeah,
It turns out that
yeah,
we can talk about C. elegans, and,
yeah,
and
yeah,
actually they're really cool and doing all this kind of stuff, and yet we expected humans to have one thing that, like, oh, this is what made us human, or there's this one event. It's a sort of an anti-evolutionary, very much a creationist perspective, but many people, even many scientists, have this sort of, oh, well, there's something very distinctive, one event that made us human. So I think it's this multiple things. Like I wrote this book, right? The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional. And some of the reviewers who didn't really, or some people who didn't really read it were like, oh, Fuentes is saying there's one thing that made us human. And my whole point is, no, there's not. There's these multiple capacities, but this creativity and imagination, cooperation, communication, that's a particularly distinctive thing. That didn't make us human. That's part of being human. And I think this is a much more interesting and more evolutionarily relevant story. This very complicated idea that there wasn't sort of like, boom, one thing that made us human, but rather this very complex multiple lineage mixing, multiple adaptations and changes, and humans emerge. I think that's better and less creationist.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to the Creative Spark, fascinating book. We will talk about especially the creative side to it because that's
Yeah,
again another interesting thing. But other book that you have written is about myths of
yeah,
race, sex, etc. Right? Um, so and we need to understand this evolutionary history to understand about the human nature in
right,
general, right?
right,
I mean,
right.
that's the culmination of whatever happened in the past and what's happening now, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think what's really interesting, a giant project. I'm just finishing up a big theater project called "Concepts in Dynamic Assemblages: Cultural Evolution and the Human Way of Being." And I
Uh-huh.
think what's really important is that resonates with what we're talking about right now. The way we perceive the world, the way we conceptualize what it means to be human or what human evolution is, really is a mix of our histories, our psychologies, all of those kinds of things. And sometimes we impose that, or the way we think of it makes us interpret it in certain ways. And so I think the careful study of human evolution, right, with an understanding that we start with complexity, gets us much further, right, along than the sort of linear notion. The problem is it's super complicated, and anyone can look to human evolution and say, oh, there's this one thing, and that explains this one thing today. And anyone who tells you a simple story about human evolution is pretty much wrong.
Yeah. And this also brings us to the point where we can start comparing, for example, us to the other hominins,
Hmm.
apes, primates, right? Other
Yeah.
animals in general, and then try and see like what are the properties that we have which are unique,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I actually would push against the word unique. I think distinctive,
This
because
is
there's almost nothing unique about humans biologically, because that's that one underlying theme of evolutionary processes, right? Evolution links everything together on the planet.
yeah.
And so while you and me and a C. elegans worm are very, very different, we do have a few things in common. So yeah, but I think this comparative approach that you just mentioned is sort of uh, it's not the silver bullet, but it's a critical baseline for doing any work. That's why I just am very lucky to be trained in sort of primatology, animal behavior, natural history, sort of anthropology, biology, genetic. I've been trained in these different areas and worked extensively with different kinds of scholars from all these different areas, because really one individual, one discipline doesn't get us the kind of information. So the comparative approach is really important, because if we don't study monkeys and apes, we can't really understand what are the really interesting things to study about humans, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we think is distinctively human, or most people think is distinctively human, it's actually just because we're primates, right? A lot of that stuff. And that's really fascinating. And it's humbling, right? Because a lot of humans think we are the end all be all of everything. And then you go out and hang out with some, orangutans or macaque monkeys. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, these are pretty cool. Or, whales, or, dolphins. There's octopus.
Yeah.
There's so many amazing organisms. So comparison is really important. Octopus is a good example of this too, because humans and octopuses, it should be octopi, but it is octopuses is correct. Um, Human and octopuses share a wide range of overlap in some behavioral and sensory dynamics, but our bodies are radically different. Our lives are different, and our evolutionary histories are different. So that convergence is really interesting. So differences and similarities. And the last thing, I'm rambling on here, but people forget that evolution is really characterized by two things. One is continuities, right? The connections between all life. And two is discontinuities, the distinct patterns of certain lineages. And so to really do evolutionary work, you have to both study the continuities and the discontinuities. You can't pick one or the other.
And even if we find, let's say, one property which is distinct compared to, let's say, another primates
Yeah,
or etc. Um, I mean, in nature, we do have convergent evolution,
yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
it may
Yeah,
happen that, okay, even if, yeah, so convergent evolution, I really like the topic in general because
yeah,
that just defines that there are also sort of limitation where evolution can take us
yeah,
because
yeah,
the point being that we start with different raw material and we end up with one with similar phenotype that, as we call
yeah,
it, right?
Yeah.
So that's also there that's also in the mix.
And I love that. And I think we're very lucky. Those of us who've been trained. So, for example, one of my undergraduate degrees is in zoology.
Hmm.
And so being forced to engage with multiple phenotypes or body morphology and multiple ecologies across the animal kingdom, for example, you get a really good understanding that it's not just about genetics and sort of the possibility of adaptation. Like the structures of environments matter, right? That relation between organisms and environments, niche construction and other things are so important. And that's why you get, and convergence, I think, is a really amazing area to study. I love the comparative analysis of wings, for example, wings on insects, wings in mammals, wings in birds, right? Gliding wings in reptiles. It's absolutely fantastic because there are constraints in that we live on a planet and
Yeah.
there are physical realities to this planet that constrain the possibility of evolutionary dynamics.
Yeah. So in the book, you also describe that there are different types of inheritance. It's not
Yeah,
genetics; it's also more than that, right? So
yeah.
let's talk about this topic as well.
Yeah, so there's in the extended evolutionary synthesis, and there's a number of different scholars who've also written on this, and this has been well known. And I would even encourage folks to read some of Darwin's original work. He actually talked a little bit about not cultural inheritance, but different kinds of extrasomatic inheritance beyond the body. So we tend to think of biologically speaking as genetic inheritance, that is the passing down of gametes across with the genetic material across generations. That's the sort of key of inheritance. That's the sort of evolutionary relevant one. But we know that genetic inheritance is not the only kind of inheritance that matters. So we have ecological inheritance. That is, organisms are born into environments that have been modified or manipulated by their parents in previous generations, and or they're consistent in particular patterns. That is, that they're given their parents are in certain places. So environmental inheriting an environment. We also have, really interesting behavioral inheritances. A lot of organisms aren't hardwired to do much of what they do in their life. Their bodies and neurobiologies and genetics give them capacity to do things, but they have to learn how to do a lot of the things that they do. So there's this inheritance across, from generation to generation of behavior. And then in humans and some other organisms, we have what's called cultural inheritance. That is inheritance of social traditions and particular ways of engaging the world. We humans are particularly interesting because language, particularly written language now, gives us a very, very specific type of inheritance pattern. But we also have all of those other inheritances, right? You inherit genetics from your parents. You inherit a particular place. You're born in a place. You're born in a particular culture. You're born into particular kinds of ecologies. But then you learn also through this transition. So again, that was a long ramble, but I think it's really important to point out that it is not just genes that pass from generation to generation. It's a whole bunch of different threads of inheritance, right? And epigenetic inheritance as well. So developmental processes, cultural processes, behavioral processes, and genetic processes are all really important.
I mean, this question would be more like for neuroscientists and stuff, but I was reading somewhere, I forgot the source, but and it was interesting observation that the brains evolved so that, we can sort of go out of the effect of genetics per se,
Yeah.
in this sense. I don't know where I read it. I should find the source. But yeah, I think it's like really interesting message that in that sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is, characteristic. And here, we get into some debates about how do we understand neurobiology and things like that. But I would argue, and this is well supported, that, for example, mammalian and avian, right, mammals and birds' brains, and other brains too, but mammals and birds' brains are particularly sort of not just the brains, but the whole sort of neurobiological system. Um, is a product of an evolutionary history that facilitates sort of emergent properties and many, many more dynamics that are not solely constrained by, let's say, the genetic inheritance or even just the specific phenotype, the behavioral flexibility and things like that. When we get to certain mammalian groups, the highly social mammals, right, the hominin lineage, us humans, right, cetaceans, right, whales, dolphins, porpoises, the primate lineage, some of the very, very social mammals, the proboscideans, right, the elephants, some of the canids. Anyway, when we get to that, you're right. It's that the way the neurobiological system develops facilitates a kind of behavioral plasticity and behavioral innovation that is much more than you can do with just direct sort of genetic or physiological constraints. And that's amazing. I mean, really, one of the most striking things that we don't talk about that much anymore is that humans really, for the complexity that we don't have that many genes, right? What do we have? Between 22, 25,000 genes. Many other things have many, many, many more copies. And so this is one of these great examples where it's not beyond or instead of the genes. That's just we've evolved, as have many mammals, social mammals and birds, in combination with the genetic and physiological reality, an incredibly plastic neurophysiology that allows us to do stuff. Let me give you one example too that I love about humans, and this is again neurobiological stuff, which I think it's very, very complicated and difficult, but it's really worth reading a little bit if you're interested in this area, because contemporary neurobiology is fascinating. Humans, as we grow, right, we are born with our brains only about 40% of their full size. That is 60% of the neurobiological development happens post-birth in humans. That's the most of any mammal. Most mammals, even ones with less developed brains at birth, like chimpanzees, that's 60% of their growth is inside, and then 40% outside. The majority of our brain grows outside in a social context, in a cultural context, and so we layer on between the birth and like early teenage, right? 10, 11, 12 years of age, we just build all of these neural connections and all this incredible plasticity and capacities. Then, around 14, 15 through the early 20s, we actually prune that neuro complexity. We actually get rid of a lot of that because it's just unnecessary. But that plasticity, that capacity is this incredibly adaptive process, which allows us to be so much more than just the physical. It allows us to sort of incorporate knowledge, histories, relations, behaviors in ways that are really dynamic and plastic. And that makes studying humans really hard, but it also makes it very interesting.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, of course, it's again different point, but cancer generally is related to to the growing cells, because
Yeah,
the cells needs to divide, and uncontrolled growth leads to
yeah,
cancer, right?
yeah.
But the neurons, they do not cause cancer. I mean, it's
No, no,
the
no, no,
cells,
no, no.
yeah,
And it
in
and
the
it's
brain.
really, we expand the number of neurons, but that hits a sort of a finite point, or more or
Yeah.
less. But what's really, it's this sort of building and rebuilding of connections, neuronal connections, that are sort of connectome projects that they talk about in neurobiology. That's absolutely amazing with humans, because we know that human brains actually are individually very different in their function, but morphologically, actually, brains aren't that different, right? Contemporary human brains, they vary in size, right? They're big and small. That is irrelevant. Size doesn't matter for humans. Um, and the physiological, the actual like morphology, if you're holding a brain in your hand, it doesn't tell you that much about individuals, but the function of the brain, when it's in the brain, in the body, working, it's absolutely amazing. There's a paper just published a few weeks ago that showed that, as we well know, when you look at sort of connectome processes or MRIs, when you look at brain function in a living human, they're individually highly variable. That you and me have very distinctive brain patterns, right? Every individual is very distinctive, and that's really fascinating. You can easily identify individuals. This paper actually looked at what happens when you put people, not when people are sleeping, but when you put them under anesthesia, like serious anesthesia. And it turns out that brains under anesthesia are really hard to tell apart. They don't actually have those individual signatures that characterize us, which is fascinating. That means being conscious and aware is part of the individual stuff that makes us us. In fact, anesthetized humans look just like anesthetized macaque monkeys in their brain patterns. It's really fascinating.
It is. I mean, please share the link. I think I can just like
Yeah, email me. I'll share it.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a fascinating
it's
article.
really, yeah, it is. It is. I knew something about like because I was checking into as some of the like other the recreational drugs in a way, which also people thought that they increase the brain activity, but apparently it was shown that in general they decrease the brain activity. So yeah, or like during meditation, it's a completely different kind of observations in this sense.
So what's really interesting, since we're on the neurobiology, and yeah, all these different things, sometimes they don't increase activity, but they focus activity, some a variety of different kinds of drugs or meditation practices. But what people don't realize, and I think for me was just a mind-blowing thing working with neurobiologists over time, once I learned this a long time ago, was the default state, what's called the resting state for the human brain, is when you're really not doing anything, you're just sort of zoning out. The default state is a social state. It's the same state, basic set of patterns as when you're interacting with people. So humans over time, right, our evolutionary, part of our evolutionary dynamic is that even when we're totally alone, zoning out, our brain is still in social relation. That is, what's still doing the kind of stuff that we do. And that's, I think, for me, a good demonstration of how important social relations are as the very heart of what humans do.
Yeah. The other important thing that you describe about human evolution is the creativity, right?
Yeah,
So let's go there, and because of course all those things that we discussed, it's the evolutionary history, but also at
right.
present how we utilize the social connections, etc. Right? All this somehow is also kind of linked to creativity, how we use creative
Yeah.
thinking, creative process to do stuff.
I mean, humans are spectacular in this sense, and we don't give ourselves enough credit. Each human every day is doing all sorts of creative things that we don't even think about. We solve problems all the time, but not just that, we come up with innovative perspectives. Think about daydreaming, or just think about the way in which you can let your mind wander and things fill it up, and you sort of run on these different trajectories, or you remember things, or and it could be really bad. You could also create all sorts of worry and panic and freaking out in your head. But evolutionarily speaking, the capacity for this sort of what we could call offline thinking and creating is really important, right? Almost every organism has this sort of cued activity, right? That if you put an apple in front of an organism and an organism has had that apple before, or you or me have had it, we can look at an apple, we can remember what it tastes like. We can recreate in our mind the sound when we bite into it, the crunch, the juices, all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, humans also have the capacity for completely uncued mental representation, right? We can not be anywhere near an apple, and we could think of an apple, or we could think of something we've never seen before. We can think of an apple, but then we could modify that into this giant, like octopus like thing with, tentacles and apple, whatever. The bottom line is that we have a very plastic capacity for developing not just mental imagery, but mental associations. And this capacity can be translated into physical action, especially when it's done in relation to others. So creativity is very, very powerful in relation to others, not just in problem solving, but also in sort of development of more and more types of behavior or contexts or perspectives. I mean, look at the diversity of human societies around the planet. And that right there is an incredible homage to human creativity.
And how did it evolve?
Well, so, I've proposed a bunch of things. A number of other people have. There's a really good giant overview volume called the Handbook. I think it's the Oxford Handbook or the Cambridge Handbook of Creativity, and it just has a great bunch. I have a chapter in there, a bunch of really good chapters of people talking about these kinds of things. So, how do I think creativity evolved? I think a critical aspect of primate sociality, all primates, is this kind of interrelation. So that we, as primates, most primates rely on one another to sort of make it in the world, right? These sort of connections. And because they rely on other individuals in their group, or even other groups, communication or navigation, social negotiation is really important. So primates really know how to get along and how to fight, right? And that forces them to be able to engage in a number of different kinds of scenarios and to keep those scenarios in their head and to sort of have these kinds of relations. We know that pretty early on in the hominoid and hominin evolution, right? Sort of our ancestors of 7 to 10 million years ago were already sort of using tools. They might have been using rocks to crack nuts or sticks to do things. But over the last 4 million years or so, our ancestors, the hominins, began to move beyond just the use of materials for some end and began to modify materials themselves. That is, they took stones and smack them on the ground to change their shape so that they worked in a different way. That capacity, right, to take a stone, one of the hardest subjects on substances on the planet, and to recognize inside that stone is another shape that can be used in a particular way. That was a major transition. And we see evidence of this at least 3.5 million years ago. But increasingly, especially as our genus, the genus Homo, shows up in the fossil record over the last 2.5, 3 million years, we start to see different types of tools, stone, bone, wood, and other manipulations of the world for functional ends initially. But then we start to see, moving beyond just making of tools, we start to see manipulation of things for sensory or symbolic ends. And we even get things like the use of fire. And fire is great for a function to keep you warm, to keep animals away, but it also cooks food. It also gives you light. So we start to see this cascade, this expansion of a capacity to see the world around us, to see what's there, to look at all that, take that in, and imagine new possibilities and try to make them reality. And that is sort of the adaptive pattern of creativity. And that's how I think it emerged in, I mean, that's a very abbreviated version. And I'm not talking about all the sort of physiological, genetic, and neurobiological changes, but you can see that pattern. And I think it's very important. And in one sense, it helps explain the best of us and the worst of us, right? Because creativity, this ability to sort of really come up with novel things that are not in the here and now, allows us to do all sorts of amazing and a lot of really horrible things.
Yeah, I had like a conversation with Kenneth Catania, who wrote a
Hmm.
book recently on the art and craft of doing science, and
Mm.
he basically compares in the book the process of science, or the way we do science, and writing, for example.
Yeah.
And he's like, if you ask any writer where do the ideas come from, they, because it's a huge black box,
Yeah.
how we come up with these innovative ideas, right? So yeah, like, I mean, of course there is no answer to it, apparently it's just something, some magical black box, right?
Well, I mean, it's magical in some ways, and it's we're unpacking some of that.
Mm.
So this big giant concepts in dynamic assemblages research project is like 8 universities, 45 scholars, all these different projects, really fascinating. One thing that we're really discovering is that cultural concepts, the way in which you sort of perceive the world to be, interacts with all the things around you and your life, shaping and sort of facilitating certain kinds of ideas, right? Certain kinds of patterns, and I think that's one of the answers, right? That sort of who you're born in, the world that you're born into, and the way in which you navigate that world is going to direct you in particular ways. Um, but the other thing I think that's really important is that I think we underplay our ability to onboard information, right? As we grow up, right, our whole lives, we're constantly taking in visual and other sensory information. We're learning things, we're making connections together. And much of that is not overt or super conscious. It's happening. And we're able to draw on that and pull that back up. And I think that's really important. And finally, and this is I've written about in my book on belief, something that humans really, that's tied to this creativity, that's really powerful, is that we can take all of these experiences, right? Our growing up, our context, the things people tell us, the things we learn, the things we experience, and we can put that all together and focus it on an idea or an ideology or a practice, so much so that that thing, that idea, that concept, that practice becomes fully real, right? We experience it as fully real, and so commit to it, and that's really powerful. And so all of this range of things, right, is part of that black box of where do humans come up with the stuff they come up with.
I mean, I think this is also this thing about manifestation, right?
Yeah,
In principle, you're just thinking about those things, probably what you want and stuff, and at the end, if you like sort of manifest it,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's also in a terrifying sense how we're highly manipulable, particularly in the contemporary media landscape, right? With the sort of internet access, the constant interface with mobile devices and things like that. The inputs we're getting, much of which is not actively, we don't consciously, analyze every input. We're getting so much stuff going on, and we can see that nudges us, right? This is the entire way that this is the money making model of social media and all of the internet is like we're going to nudge you slowly into these different directions, or the guy who invented the forever scroll, right? That whole idea that you can continue as opposed to having to link down across pages. The nudges, the structures that we get from our what we onboard centrally and perceptually is really important, and that directs us in ways. That's why I think it's really important to be very aware of what you're inputting, right? And understanding, because those inputs and the way we process them is such a critical part of the human evolutionary story, but it's also a critical part of our daily lives. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that.
There is also this confirmation bias element to it, right?
Yeah,
The way that we have something in our mind now, whether it could be for belief or sort of
yeah,
accessing the way we access the information, it could be just because of the bias that we have, or it's like again,
yeah,
we are trying to focus our torch on that specific topic.
yeah. Yeah, no, and that's one of the hardest things about science, right? Is that, for all scientists say science is totally objective and neutral. No, we try to be objective. That's why we have scientific methodology and retesting and engage. Because as humans, we are not objective. You cannot be fully objective as a human because of the way our perceptual systems and neurobiologies and cultures and societies work. I have a great study. I mean, years ago, I think it's in Creative. I wrote it in Creative Spark, or at least the Why We Believe book. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. Yeah, 30 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. I don't remember. But a colleague and I, two people trained in watching primates, right? We're standing next to each other at this one site. And this really interesting happens with these macaque monkeys. They're running around to do this stuff. We're both standing at it. We're both taking notes. We're both watching the same thing. We turn to each other and we both describe two totally different things. And that's because we had very different training and very different sort of commitments to sort of how to look at things. And so I focused one area, he focused on another area. Even though we were watching the same behavior, we did see and interpret two different things. And that's one of the challenges, particularly with behavioral observation and scientific analysis of things. You've got to really think about methodology and clarity, because we always bring biases with us. We're human, we're biased.
Yeah, and what about as a collective?
And that's even more powerful, right? Because a lot of our biases come from these cultural dynamics and collectives. And again, this is back to this project I was talking about, the concepts and dynamic assemblages. The dynamic assemblage of bodies, culture histories, economics, local ecologies, and sort of received or learned information. That's very powerful. It's so powerful that sort of, people say we are who we meet. I'm sorry, we are what we eat. I think it's more like we are who we meet, right? It's who we hang out with that really shapes us, and which cultures we are. And so those collective perceptions and those collective commitments and beliefs really impact the way in which we see the world. And that's why, this is this classic case of all the sort of Western philosophers, right? Aristotle contributed a lot, right? But he had a very specific historical frame. And so we have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. He wasn't objective, right? He was arguing from a particular perspective in a particular context. And the same is true today, for scientists, and the best scientists recognize this, right? You recognize with a certain amount of humility that one of our biggest challenges, whether in the lab or in the field or doing broad scale overview analytics, is to see what your biases are, try to understand them as best you can, and not pretend like they're not there, but rather to work through the scientific method and a sort of, I would argue, an intellectually generous engagement with scientific data and analyses to try to do the best representation as possible, acknowledging that you're never going to be without bias.
I mean, at least at this point of time, all the people who are doing science, they are humans. So,
Yeah.
so of course we come with all the package. But
Yeah.
the point being that, yeah, I mean, if the method that we have, because sometimes it's not just about about the process. It's the
Yeah,
method or the tool that we develop,
absolutely.
and what is the sort of significance of the tool itself.
Yeah, and I think this is really important. So let me talk about the tool in a moment, but back what we were talking about creativity. So one of the reasons why, and I'm a big critic of sort of full AI innovation, that like let's let AI take care of this. One of my problems is that AI can't create, right? Not like a human. It can't do. We can train it to do all sorts of amazing stuff. It's absolutely incredible with the computing power, although climactically really bad, right? I think we have to balance the what they do. Anyway, that's off on a tangent. Um, what I think is really amazing is although we're biased and flawed as humans, our creativity and our lack of linear logic, right? Humans are people want to think humans are rational and always like logical, and we're definitely not. But that's led to some of the biggest science breakthroughs, right? This notion that we can try to be methodologically rich and all that, but every now and then we're going to be like, wait a minute, and come up with something totally off the wall that is not a logical derivation of what we're doing. Sometimes that's what good science really takes, right? That kind of thing. The technology, though, I think is really important, the tools, because the tools, if done right, open us up to have more of this creativity, right? So when I was first taking genetics classes and doing genetics research, right, we would take samples and then we would run them across gels, right? I mean, this was so exciting. Oh, you get the, but it took forever, and you got certain amount of information that today seems absurdly limited, right? We really learned almost nothing. Now I've had students, who run with these multi-well sequencers, and in 3 days they've done more sort of genetic analyses than I did in the 20 years before that. And it's that technology is incredible. And so in the best world, that technology frees us to think more, right? To sort of do more analyses. The challenge, though, I think for us humans is what we've been talking about as well, is our biases. Because if we tend to offload the creativity and the thinking to those technologies, then we in fact are fooling ourselves because they're much more limited than we are in the analysis. So it's a good human technology partnership, I think, that we're seeking. And that's part of our evolutionary story. It wasn't that the stone tool, like when you made a sharp rock to do stuff, that didn't change everything, right? It was part of the process of changing everything, because the stone tool was part of it. But as important as the tool itself was the concept of a tool that you then shared with other individuals. And you created modes of teaching and learning and transmitting this. And that reshaped the way in which we saw the world. And so it's never just the tool. It's never just the technology. It's always the sort of the way in which it interfaces with the human relational and social experience.
Yeah, another point which, of course, you also mentioned in the book, but I also think in along these lines that first of all, I mean, humans, we don't really get satisfied with one solution, right? We kind of play around with the stuff. So that's one thing, and this is where also sort of understanding of science and scientific method becomes a little bit important, because if you have a problem, then what is the best way to find a
Right,
solution, right?
right,
So
right.
so yeah, let's talk about this.
So I think, yeah, and I do mention this in the book, and this is something that's vexed me, but throughout my entire career, because I think it's really interesting. This human, in a positive way, we could say curiosity, right? But in a negative way, it's just we always want to tweak things. We're never satisfied with something in the right. I as a child years ago, I wrote a poem just thinking philosophically, and it's in the Abrahamic traditions, right? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. There's a heaven, right? Well, in general, and there's sort of this notion of heaven. Many religions have that. But in Christianity, there's the Garden of Eden, right? That you go to after not the Garden of Eden. Sorry, the heaven is this sort of the best possible place. And so one thing that I wrote when I was young, it was always this sort of notion that humans would get there. I thought humans would show up in heaven finally after everything, and they would look around and they'd be like, "Oh, is this it?" And I think we have this notion of never being satisfied with where we are, and I think that's really good in the sense of science, because we always want to know more. And scientific methodology facilitates that, because we science won't give us the truth, end period, but it's going to get us closer to potential and possible truths, and let us keep questing, right? Keep experimenting, keep moving towards that. And so this sense of unease, right, with the limits of knowledge is very powerful. But at the same time, it makes us very annoying, right? We constantly change things, right? Things work fine sometimes, and we go and mess them up and change things. And not just in the capitalist sense, and not just for making money, right? It's not just making new Coke again and again and again to try to get more people to buy it. But I think there is this trigger in humans that we're so inquisitive that the status quo, what we see in front of us, always inspires us to manipulate it a little bit more.
And if we think about, let's say that, that there are like different processes, right? Um, Still, I mean, just to sort of kind of understand, like, okay, how science can contribute, or how we can really understand the something like emergence of science, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
how scientific method came into existence. Uh, and then I think because a lot of stuff at the beginning was done, I mean, simply that we were thinking about planetary stuff, or
right,
or simple, like, let's say, the physics, or these kind of models, right?
right,
Which, if we will draw on complexity scale, I think they are like fairly simple compared to some of the other challenges that we have. For example, biology, like human
yeah,
nature,
yeah,
social structure, etc. Right? These are like way difficult questions. So of course, like these questions, they may not have like a particular value as we get for gravity, for example, right?
right, right,
So
right, right.
I think it also depends on the kind of problem that we are sort of addressing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. But I would, as you probably would too, I think I would lean on the scientific method is not the only way for engaging. Sort of science is not the only method for answering questions. I think philosophers, theologians, there's a lot of other ways that are very important. But for me, I happen to be sort of a data and analysis geek. I mean, I really like to work through problems in a sense of the scientific method. That is, we've made observations, or there's something out there. There's some way to analyze these data. We're going to refine those methods. We're going to continue to refine that to get better. And you're right. When we talk about something like human nature, is actually the book I have coming out in a year or two, Human Natures, because I think there's many successful ways to be human. There's not a simple equation, right? We're not going to get something like a rate of movement that we get for gravity, but we might get a series, not of equations, but a series of models that then help us understand what these processes are. And so I think science, even in the most fuzzy, complicated areas of investigation, can help us as a process, as a method to winnow down and to help analyze these really complex things. For me, the human natures component, there's a lot of philosophical and big things that are very important, but I'm also very interested in neurobiology, in behavior and bodies, and how they interface with each other and with their environments. And I think that's actually one piece that science can give us a lot of information about, that then helps us ask these broader sort of existential questions about processes. So I would argue that science is always valuable in every situation. I think many people would disagree, but that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's healthy, right?
Yeah,
That's also
yeah,
like that's again a process of science. You can disagree,
yeah.
but then just bring the data, right? I mean,
And this is actually one of the things that I think is a big crisis for science right now. And I'm involved in this in some ways in different things. Is the idea that um, many reviewers, sort of much of the process of science is constrained by positions of power, distribution of resources, things like that, rather than the kind of curiosity and intellectual generosity that should be spurring science, right? We should be able, like, I review things all the time. I'm like, I disagree with this conclusion. I do not like these interpretations, but I see their methods. I see the data they're working with. We disagree on what they mean, but this is still a valid project. This should still be published, right? And I think right now there's too much antagonism within sort of science reviews, and this sort of battle over limited good for funding, especially emerging now in the US. It's going to be really bad. So it's a time for, I think, scientists to practice a little bit more care, intellectual rigor, but just to be a little bit more open to the possibility that you don't have to agree with folks if they're doing something that's methodologically identifiable, that the data are valid, and you don't have to agree with the interpretation. That's a hard thing for people to do because we're biased, right? We like our own interpretations. It's just we have to recognize that they might be wrong. All of the best things I've learned as a scholar, right, over the multiple decades that I've been doing this stuff, the things I've really learned well that have stuck with me, that have made a difference for me, was when I was wrong, not when I was right. Right. The experiments, the work that is like, oh yeah, it's like I thought. That actually does not tell you nearly as much as going out, collecting data, doing some analysis, doing a thing, being like, oh, I was totally wrong. That I think that humility, but also that opens up the sort of landscape for creativity and for rethinking stuff that you thought you knew and learning it again.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I mean, about the, the sort of this process, the way we sort of do science, and all the things which are happening. I think it's also sort of a competition about resources. It's really like, I mean, if we just tone it down, it's like, living in the forest, or in jungle, I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be how we just manage resources. It's also, how much importance we see in science, and
Yeah.
also like the projects that we are doing and stuff. The
Yeah.
the thing is, of course, like, we can start predicting future of humanity, and then sort of designating the grants and funds, right?
Right.
The resources. But apparently we are not good at that, I think, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I think we keep thinking this is why, science of human evolution, like science of us, is really hard because of our own biases, right? We're sure we know what's us and what's best for us. So I love for years, and you can still see this a little bit. There's a lot of just bad, incorrect science out there, like, oh, humans are going to get bigger heads. We're not going to get bigger heads, or these different weird hypotheses. It's really interesting, the predictive science. It's gotten better, I think, because now instead of predicting some big adaptation, some big change, we're realizing it's all about tweaking the existing system. And we're trying to understand what those patterns of changes or patterns of tweaks are. Really, these bodies we have now, I mean, they've changed, but not that substantially over the last few 100,000 years. So it's not like massive morphological change that's going to really change for humans. It's physiological, endocrinological, cognitive. Those are the patterns, and that's much more complicated, but very interesting. But you're right. I mean, trying to predict like what's the science of the future, I would say almost every one of those predictions is going to be wrong.
Because there are so many examples where, I mean, even scientists, they didn't think of, that discovery would
Yeah,
happen, but and it did happen, starting from
yeah,
penicillin to
yeah,
the tool that we are using for genetic engineering nowadays,
yeah,
CRISPR,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I
So
mean, so many of these things, and that's like so. Back to human evolution, I've actually stopped writing. I had a intro to biological anthropology textbook that I would write every 3 or 4 or 5 years, just updated. I'm not writing intro textbooks in that sense anymore because every few months there's a new find or a new thing, and it just changes the whole setup. And we're in this such moment of discovery that's technologically aided, but also cognitively aided. We're I think better open to more discoveries, and here I think is really important that a lot of the scientists doing the work now are scientists from around the world, not just a couple places. It's not just folks from the UK and Germany and UK, Europe, and North America doing work. Work is being done around the world, and that's really changing the pattern of innovation, and I would argue really benefiting our understanding and our creativity in the scientific endeavors. And so I'm very excited for that, but it is really hard because studying humans is super complicated. It's really good that more people around the world are doing it. But then we get back to the resource problem, right? I mean, much of the world just does not have the resource base that a few countries do. And so there's the challenge, I think, for the wealthy science nations or in the institutes is how do we distribute that? How do we make this infrastructure for good science more broadly available?
and what's your approach to it? I mean, because do you do like a lot of armchair philosophy before going and doing the experiment, or what? Or yeah, what's your
I
approach?
mean, I mean, so in one sense, armchair philosophy. I mean, really, really getting familiar with what's been written and published on a topic or a subject is important. I'm very concerned, and I see this in a lot of folks now. People go out with a very limited training, right, or a limited range of what's been written out there, especially because they focus on, again, North American or European stuff, or only English language stuff. Or many people go to places the world, for example, where there's tons of master's theses or a lot of research done on particular questions, but they don't pay any attention to that. They just look at what's been shown up in Science or Nature or something like that. One of the main ones. So I think that's a big challenge. But yes, before I do projects at this point, because I'm a senior scholar, right? I mean, I've been doing this for decades, right? I finished my dissertation 31 years ago,
Wow.
right? So for 31 years, I've been like a doctor of whatever.
Mhm.
And I have been doing this. And so at this point now, I have a very, very broad basis. But what's that has shown me is every new question I ask, before I get to actually doing work on that question, I try my best. And it's almost impossible because there's so much information, but my best to be as well informed on that subject as I can be. And now I always try to work in teams, right? So it's sort of the armchair part is connecting, reading, understanding. And then in the field or in the lab, it's putting together the right teams, working with the right range of expertises, because no one individual has sufficient expertise anymore, especially with regards to human evolution, and then being open to new possibilities. So clearly, I go in with preconceived notions. Everyone does, but I try my best to have as many diverse and engaged eyes and minds on the topic as possible, and that can, I think, produce better results.
And that's very important because we can take another example like paleo diets, right?
Yeah.
Uh, um, okay, what's your comment on it?
So I would recommend everyone read work by Professor Herman Ponzer at Duke University. He's done some really good stuff about metabolism and paleo diets and things like that. Paleo diet is nonsense, right? That is, humans evolve and adapt and acclimatize across time. There is no one diet for humans. It depends on where you grew up, what the context is, what your bodies are like, what your sort of lineage and histories are like. But the idea that there was one kind of right way to eat for humans is wrong. What we do know, right, is that we need a range of nutrition, right? Particular nutrients at particular times in our lives. Like our needs change as we, are born and grow up to across the different ages and start to senesce. So the whole idea that there's one like natural diet for humans is wrong. We're omnivores, right? We need a mix of particular kinds of proteins, other kinds of nutrients, fats, all these kinds of things. How we get that mix, right, is incredibly diverse. There are many, many, many different ways. And so when someone's like, let's eat this, that's the right thing. All these diet gurus, some of them have good ideas about certain things, but anyone who tells you there's only one way to eat as a human is simply wrong. And we know from the dietary study, just even looking at the teeth of our ancestors and related lineages over time, they're in hugely variable diets, right? If you look at humans today, healthy humans have enormous variation in what they eat. Clearly, there are basic nutrients we need, but the way to get those is highly diverse.
So, what are the sort of lessons that we can learn from studying human evolution, specifically about diets?
So, I mean, one thing that we can learn is that the dietary needs of young individuals or growing individuals, right, when they're still putting on multiple sort of tissue development, that is bone and muscle and a variety of other things, are different in some senses and more constrained than adults. That they need certain kinds of dietary patterns, certain kinds of fats, certain kinds of protein setups, and really a range of minerals and amino acids. So we know that there's a range of diet needed for most humans as they grow up. As we mature, one thing that we can identify is metabolic processes and patterns, sort of what does individual variation in your metabolism look like, and that's going to have a huge impact on diet. The one thing I will say that's very, very clear is that hyper-processed food, that is, things that are modified multiple times away from like the plant or the animal that they come from, incur a number of difficulties in digestion and create a number of chemical structures on them that can potentially cause problems in both our digestive systems and the way in which we uptake those nutrients and translate those nutrients into tissues and other organs and things like that. So I would say the one lesson we can take is that um, massively modified food is harder for humans to survive on than less modified food. That's a good one. Another good one is that to remember we're omnivores, right? Everyone has their own preference. Everyone's like, you should eat this or not eat this. Yeah, you need certain proteins, you need certain fats, you need certain minerals, you need certain amino acids. Figure out how you're going to get those, but don't pretend like there's one natural diet for humans.
I mean, coming from a place where a lot of people are vegetarian, I have seen that people generally have replaced their sort of diets from dairy in a way,
Right.
like probably that's the way to get like animal
Yeah.
protein and mineral and nutrients, right?
Yeah, in the contemporary context, I mean, we have technologies, we have the abilities, so we've cultivated and modified many plants to radically up their particular kinds of proteins. I would hesitate to encourage vegetarianism in children
Mhm.
heavily because animal protein is really important for mammalian growth, and particularly in humans. Um, and so you have to think very carefully about how you're maximizing those things. But as adults, I mean, in most contemporary landscapes, you can be vegetarian and still get the majority. You just have to be very careful about what you're doing. On the other hand, eating just meat or a ton of meat is also extremely harmful. And one has to be very careful, not just for the physiological thing, but also what that does to our environment and what that does to the world. I think we need balance, right? We need to sort of figure out we're omnivores. How do we do that in a way that's good for our bodies and good for the world around us? And I would argue in the contemporary moment, that's really hard, right? Because food is expensive and there are more than 8 billion humans on the planet, and feeding those humans is challenging. Um, but the extremes, like eating only nuts and wild grasses or eating all McDonald's, those two things are both wrong, right? Those are bad. Let's find some way in between. Um, I am unfortunately have to go shortly, so
Okay, so
let
let's
me know
say
what else we need to.
like
Yeah,
what, 5 minutes? How
sure. Yeah,
okay, okay. Um, Let me check. I think maybe we can just talk about a couple of more things and then we can,
cool.
yeah. So, okay. So, I mean, since we are discussing about human evolution, and also the creativity part, the imagination is also important, right? The way we imagine
Yeah,
things, the way
yeah.
we sort of again come up with the ideas and stuff. So, what is the role of imagination when it comes to sort of human creativity, right?
I mean, we've been sort of talking about that the whole time. I think this ability to sort of look at the world around us, to see what's there, and then to draw on our experiences and our cognitive processes and our relations to others and imagine, create possible new things, I think is really important. So, imagination, this ability to just reflect and free associate or to develop things that are not tangible or that we haven't experienced, but to think about them, I think is very powerful. And that's probably led, I would argue, to human expansion and to sort of movement around the planet. I mean, it's not hard for me to imagine some groups of humans a couple 100,000 years ago living in a pretty good valley and hanging out, but there's this mountain in the distance, and one day someone's like, you know what, I think over that mountain is where we should go. And goes like, no, it's all good here. And they're like, no, we should go over that mountain. I think there's something amazing. There's a better valley. And then they go, and I probably 9 out of 10 times it was a worse valley and they died, but sometimes they found a better valley and moved on. That's a simple version, or just modification of stone tools. Like you have this sharp cutting rock, and you're cutting things and cutting things and cutting things. Um, but then you notice the more you cut, that the rock wears down, and you start to realize, oh, maybe if I work with these things, I can change the shape of the rock without breaking things. And so you innovate new ways of modifying things. And so those are simple imaginations. But I think even more complex imaginations, like growing up in the contemporary world now, reading, seeing movies, things like that, might inspire you to think about new stories, new possibilities, new ways, right, that societies can work. So I think imagination has had a central role for a long time in human evolution. I think it leads us to incredible possibilities, both good and bad. But I think it's a big part of what we do. We said earlier that humans are never satisfied, right? They always want to continue modifying stuff. I think the imagination is pushing that, right? Because we can always look at something and see that it could be different. And sometimes we try to imagine ways in which things could be different.
And another topic where I hope people will not use their imagination is something called creative sex that you use in the book, right? In the funny sense, I mean, yeah, like there could be too many things associated with it, but you use it in a specific sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it turns out that sexual relations, sexuality in many social mammals, but particularly in humans and some other primates and maybe cetaceans, sex is a very, very important social relation. And so we've seen a move from sex being only about sexual activity, being only about reproductive dynamics, as it is in some organisms, to sexuality and sexual behavior as being a central form of relation. And so I call it creative sex in that sense, because it's really interesting that humans have created all of these things around using right sexual activity then to do all of these different things. And you think about it, it's about relationships, right? It's about pleasure, it's about abuse and harm, it's about creativity and representation. Think about the use of sex in literature and cinema. We manipulate things, we write songs about it, tell stories about it. So really sexuality per se, right, sexual activity is a dynamic, creative, imaginary thing in humans. It's not just about reproduction. And that's actually a really interesting and good example of how complicated humans are and how interesting they are.
Yeah, I think there are like many facets to humans. Of course, there are some unique, or as you call them, distinct compared to
Yeah.
the other animals. And but we have done some impressive stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the way we
Yep.
have sort of modified the planet and stuff, and all the evolutionary history has contributed to this part, right?
Yeah. Set us up in the stage of the capacity to do this, right? I mean, that's so understanding human evolution helps us understand sort of how we are the way we are, partially why we are the way we are, and it helps us understand why we do what we do. It doesn't tell us everything about why we do what we do, but it gives us the basic toolkit to understand how these things work and why these things are possible. And I think that's why it should be taught in grade school for everyone, right? I mean, basic human evolution should be the starting point for a lot of understanding. It is our history and it tells us a lot about ourselves.
Yeah. And to know more about it, read or listen the creative part, right? And we'll wait for also human natures whenever it
Yeah,
comes.
yeah,
Then we can do the second part of it, of the
yeah.
conversation. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's always a great conversation. I'll be glad to come back and talk about the next book or next
Yeah,
topics.
sure.
All
Thank
right. Take care.
you. Yeah, bye.